Good morning. This is Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for May 3rd, 2023. A couple days ago, I posted a video on the ghost of Zbigniew Brzezinski to review the question of who wants the war in Ukraine to continue. And it's the Brzezinski proteges, traced through Madeleine Albright down to Blinken, Sullivan, Newland, and others. And I presented the case of Brzezinski's background as to why he had a pathological hatred of Russia. Now, today we're at a point where there's growing momentum behind the calls for negotiations to end the war, for a ceasefire and diplomatic negotiations. These are coming from China, from Brazil, from Turkey, from Hungary, from the global south, from the Pope. Now, there are also demonstrations around the world against this war, and yet the war continues. You have Biden, the US Congress, Stoltenberg of NATO, Ursula von der Leyen of the European Union, and Zelensky and his government saying there must be no negotiations with Russia. Hodges, the former US commander of troops in Europe, said, quote, "We don't need a diplomatic solution," unquote. Spoken like a true war hawk, huh? Then you have the Weasley position of Macron, who came back from China and said, quote, "Europe must reduce its dependence on the United States," meaning don't go along with the US war on China. He went on to say about Ukraine, quote, "We are not a party in this war," unquote. But then he said, "Our objective is to not allow Russia to win. The war will stop when the Ukrainians are in a position of strength," unquote. Jacques Cheminade, one of my colleagues who ran a presidential campaign against Macron, responded to this by saying that Macron's position means more Ukrainians must die. Now, this was also put forward by the Ukrainians themselves. Alexei Danilov, who's an aide to Zelensky, said, "We need arms and ammunition, not negotiations." But the Pentagon leak that the papers that came out recently shows that many in the U.S. military don't think that the special counteroffensive, the spring counteroffensive, will succeed even if it occurs. We're seeing that it's not taking place yet. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians insist that there must be more weapons, more money, more support. And just a couple of days ago, Sir Richard Dearloffe, the former head of MI6, went to Kiev to promise Zelensky continued support for the war. The same as Boris Johnson did, no negotiations, you keep fighting to degrade Russia. Now, think tanks in Britain and the United States that are funded by the military-industrial complex, such as Heritage, Jamestown Foundation, and others, are among the most vociferous supporters of continuing the war. We should also include Chatham House, the British intelligence office there, and the Atlantic Council. And these think tanks are putting out a completely fake story. They're saying, one, Russia is losing, Ukraine is winning. Secondly, a defeat of Russia in Ukraine will lead to regime change against Putin, which is something Biden called for in Warsaw last year. This will allow, three, the breakup of Russia. And why do they want Russia broken up? So they can grab the resources. Russia has plentiful natural resources. It's an ideal target for the predators of the military-industrial complex and their corporate cartels. But what they're forgetting is that it's hard to win a war like this when your opponent is a nuclear power. So it's in this context we go back to looking at the role of Brzezinski in shaping this mentality, this crazy mentality that war is an essential feature of an economic strategic policy. This is British geopolitics. And for the case of Brzezinski, it was a personal hatred of a displaced Pole against Russia. And It was, I'm sorry, it was a viewpoint that came from the United Kingdom, British geopolitics. Don't forget there was a great game, a challenge by Britain against Russia in Central Asia in the middle of the 19th century. And then this was codified into Geopolitics in 1904 by Halford Mackinder. And this is the Brzezinski outlook. Now, making this point clear was former Defense Secretary Gates, who said on Meet the Press the other day, quote, "Putin believes it's his destiny to recreate the Russian Empire. As my old mentor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, used to say, without Ukraine, there can be no Russian Empire," unquote. And Gates went on to say that therefore Putin is obsessed with retaking Ukraine and will continue to fight. So here's a perfect case of the ghost of Zbiggy continuing to speak through his military-industrial complex puppets. So what should the U.S. do? Accept the geopolitical approach of the 19th century British Empire, which is putting us on a course toward World War III? Remember, the last two world wars were the result of British geopolitics. Fight to the last Ukrainian, which is the ultimate consequence of this policy. Listen to the advice of the green ideologue, who's the foreign minister of Germany, Baerbock, who said, "We have to do what it takes to win, no matter what my German voters think." That's democracy? Well, it's useful to take a look at history very briefly at the role of the Brits in shaping the Versailles Conference, which paved the way after the World War I to keep the enmity going between Germany and the West to such an extent that it paved the way for World War II. Now, one of the issues that came up was, should Russia be part of the Versailles Conference? Because Russia had had a revolution which brought the Bolsheviks to power. And some people say that the overthrow of the Tsar was very directly a result of British intervention, and some say the emergence of the Bolsheviks was part of British intervention. The idea that if you have a revolution in Russia, it would destroy the power of the state, making it easier to keep a defeated Germany and a defeated Russia from joining up as an alliance. Now, the question then was, one of the questions at Versailles was what to do about the civil war in Russia. Should the West support the white Russian forces that were fighting the Bolsheviks or not? Now, in the midst of the debate of this, who should show up in Versailles but Winston Churchill, who was the Secretary of State for War? And Churchill made the following point. He said, British forces are already in Russia fighting. So this is after World War I had ended. British forces were there. 2, we have an obligation to the white armies, that is, the anti-Bolshevik armies. Point 3, millions of pounds have already been spent in this operation. And point 4, millions more will be needed. So we need to put the money up and get in and win this fight. Now, what was on display was Churchill's pathological hatred, not just of Bolshevism, but of Russia, and his fear of what would be the consequences for the British Empire of a Russian-German alliance, one which nearly came into fruition 3 years later with the Rapallo Agreement in June 1922, or in April 1922. But he had a pathological desire to continue the war for the sake of the position of the empire. And his argument then, his ultimate argument, was that without Allied support, the White Army would be defeated, and instead the British and the Allies should launch a full invasion of Russia, which was what Churchill was advocating at that time. Now, in response to that, U.S. President Wilson, who for the most part did not play a very good role at Versailles, but at least on this issue he was clear. Wilson said, the U.S. is not at war with Russia and would not take part in military operations there. Now, even more interesting is the comments of Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, who rebuked Churchill. And here's what Lloyd George had to say. Who is going to pay for these proposed mercenary armies? How much will France give? I'm sure that she cannot afford to pay. I'm sure that we cannot. Will America bear the expense? So even there you see that Lloyd George was saying that if there's going to be a war, it must be paid for by the Americans. That's been the attitude of NATO. And the fight between the US and NATO over who's going to pay has led to world record expenditures of weapons in a war which cannot be won in Ukraine. Now, the British continued with some covert operations inside Russia, but ultimately it fizzled and we ended up with the Soviet power consolidated. And more importantly, a deep suspicion in the Soviet Union for the West. Now, in his lifetime, Brzezinski continued to play the British geopolitical game against the Soviet Union and later against Russia. Today, his heirs, Blinken, Sullivan, Victoria Nuland, Susan Rice, and others, are continuing the march toward war, which could be the destruction of humanity in behalf of a British 19th century imperial strategy. To end this insanity, it is imperative that the people act and speak out. I ask you to join me today when I'll have a dialogue on this with Helga LaRouche about what to do to end this war. And you can get that, the link for that will be at the bottom of the description page. So thanks for joining me today. See you again later today. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.